Hello there. I am hoping everything is okay. If somebody in the chat can give me a confirmation of that, that would be amazing. We're going to talk today about the building an economy. And we're going to take it from base layer of how do you start at the core to where you build it in sort of a steady state, and then what are the levers that you have available to you that you can pull on in order to jiggle the model of the economy. Now, this economy model is currently in sort of a beta draft state. So please comment away if you have any questions, if you think something should change, and so on. So, the purpose of this model is to help the world builder create an economy for their culture, right? So, each culture that you build would have one of these economies, or would have a model sheet like this one. Um, okay, so um, I will share. There we go. All right. So, like with a culture model, the first thing you have to do when doing your economy, or the core of your economy, is you've got a couple of things that you need to decide on. The first and most important is what actually counts as wealth in your economy. In our world, we count wealth with money, but money isn't wealth per se. Wealth is your house that you own, your car, your furniture, art. All of these things are wealth. In your world, what counts as wealth? Is it land? Does land or heads of cattle count as wealth? Is there a magical resource that counts as wealth? Is there a aspect of your fantasy elements that counts as wealth? So you need to figure out that question of what to this culture is wealth. And it can vary per culture. Like I have a desert culture who consider it wealth when you have dyes, because the traders at the edge of the desert trade with the tribes for those dyes. So the more dyes you have, the more you'll be able to get goods that are made outside of the desert, right? And that those dyes represent a massive part of the wealth of the desert nomads. And then on the other hand, I have the empire in Lumiaron, the empire of Lumiaron, that for them, wealth is literally, the classical things, land and goods and minerals and all of that kind of thing. So consider what is wealth to your culture. But then you need to think about the kind of core vibe of your economy. Okay. And for this, the easiest way to do it is to put your economy on a Cartesian plane, like I've got here, this little square blocky thing. The sliding scale in the middle is who has disposal rights to the excess profit or the excess wealth of the community. Okay, so basically, this means who is allowed to sell, to dispose of wealth in the community. If it's an individual, then they'll be more towards the individual side on the play. And if it's like community based, like the community owns and disposes of the wealth, then it's to the other side. So that access in the middle is about your disposal rights, right? And your y-axis, the axis down the middle, is about what drives economic need, right? What drives the economic need and production? Like, why are things produced? So in our so you can either have it be like it's driven by the market, which in this case really means like it is driven by the need of people and the availability of people's request for goods, right? Or you can have it driven by command. So there is somebody who has the right to say that you must produce these goods, that these are the goods that must be produced by this economy, and then, it can be disposed either by private individuals or by the community. Now, in our world, so basically I've called this the steering mechanism, the top to bottom, and I've called it the disposal rights, in on the left to right. And remember, it's a sliding scale, right? This isn't the case of like you are completely off on the one end or completely off on the other. Most economies in our world is a mixture of both, right? And in your world the same should apply. But the idea is to create this core vibe of your economy. Like, what is the overall feel of your economy? But now I want you to bear in mind that we did already speak about the culture model, right? Which was this one, and it had its own core. And that core had the hierarchy versus egalitarianism, the collectivism versus individual, the free versus ordered, and the traditional versus progressive, right? That was all the core of the culture model. So with the norms of the culture. And so now you can take this, right? If you have this core of your culture and you overlay it with the core of your economy to make certain that your culture and your economy vibe with each other. Because here is the absolute truth, right? Economics does not exist in isolation. Your culture impacts economics, economics impacts your culture. The whole thing is a glorious mess. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to take the core of your economic model as we defined here, and you want to take the core of your cultural model, and you want to make sure that the two kind of match each other. And that defines the core of your economics model, not your economics model in full, just the core. So I will check a few questions. Tabby Wolf says market economies are more personal than command economies. Not necessarily. So a market economy could be community driven. We don't like per se have many of these models, but there were anarchistic communes that were still driven by market need. So you can absolutely um, do the kind of market economy um, that is more personal than the classic command economies from that we know from our world. Bear in mind that obviously, we've had a number of economic systems, and this model is based on our economic systems. But obviously, in your fantasy world, you're limited only by your imagination. You can make this any combination. They can be community orientated and market driven, and the communities, kind of produce what they should be producing, but all of the profit is accrued by the community. Um, Munan, no mercy. This is not pre-recorded. This is live, 100% live. Though I did prepare the slide deck beforehand. However, it will be available for play on demand afterwards. So you will be able to view it afterwards. Okay. So that is the core of your economy, the kind of vibes of your economy, that wealth and the Cartesian plan. And bear in mind, right, this wealth could be massively impacted by your fantasy elements. You want to be thinking of things like fantastical resources. You want to be thinking of magic and whether magic has any like contribution to the wealth of your system. Is there a part of your magic that drives the wealth and the economic aspect of your community? All right. Then, once you have your wealth, now we're going to come to the big one. Okay, so this is the actual model, and it's a little bit monstrous. So I don't know how much you guys can read. I might make this available for download afterwards because I think it'll be useful. Okay, so the foundational layer is the layer just above the core. So you've got your core with your Cartesian plane, and then your next layer up is economic objectives and property. Okay, so your questions here are: what are the primary economic objectives of the society? For example, do they want wealth accumulation? Do they want stability? Do they want innovation? Do they want sustainability? Do they want equality? What are their objectives in their model? This will also inform something that we call the ideal versus the real state, right? So, very often, economic models have an ideal state, like this is ideally what we want. High mindedly, we, the people who supposedly control the economy, no one controls the economy. But anyway, so we, the people who control the economy, we make these rules and regulations and so on to encourage certain economic behaviors and to build an economy that we think, is whatever, is fair, or will generate wealth, or will foster innovation, or will create small businesses, or will create big businesses, something. But that ideal state versus the actual state, not always the same thing, right? So what the elite class who make the rules and regulations around economic activity think the economy works and how it actually works, not always the same thing. So bear that in mind when you're creating your model, is that you do have this ideal state versus the actual state. Okay, so back to this model. On the foundational level, you want to ask questions like, what resources does this culture have? Do they have land? Do they have, you know, do they have access to dye? Do they have access to minerals? Do they have access to magic? Can they pluck the tail hairs out of unicorns and sell them to wand makers? Is there a whole industry around, fair maidens before they turn 18 and do the devil's tango, plucking, unicorn hair out of unicorns? Are spinsters valued in the society because of that? So think about, what are the actual resources available to the culture, and who makes economic decisions? Are they made collectively by individuals? And sort of, how does that impact your steering mechanism? All right. Then your next layer up from that, and like with a cultural model, it's like a up and an up. Yes. So Lupex makes a great point. Scarcity is the key word for the foundational level. You want to think about what resources are scarce and which are abundant. Abundant resources will be, usable by everyone, and scarce resources, why are they scarce? What do they generate? Do they generate something specific? Are they controlled by someone? How are they controlled? How is distribution controlled? And so on. Okay. So our next layer is the economic activity layer, or the production layer. Okay, so this is basically where you want to determine, how do people actually economically interact, right? What do they do with those resources? So if unicorns are our resources, what is the economic activity around them? Do these maidens actually get paid to go steal unicorn hair out of a unicorn's tail? What happens to the hairs after that? Is the hairs then worked by the wand makers into the core of the wand? How does that whole process work? Also, think about services here as well, right? So let's say you have a small little village in the middle of nowhere. Who is making the beer? Who is selling the beer over their, over their kitchen door? Because I promise you, somebody in that village is making beer if you've got humans involved. So think about, like, what are the people doing in this layer, in the productivity layer? What does labor add to the resources in this layer? Um, and then you also want to think about, what is you also, in your production layer, you want to think about the role of capital. Now, capital in this case basically means anything that you need in order to start economic activity. And I hope I'm being clear enough for everybody. I hope I'm not using too much jargon, but capital essentially just represents the resources that you need to start an economic activity. Like in our world, let's say if we went back to sort of like these, factories and whatever, you would need money, capital, to start to build a factory and to start the production of nails or whatever. So in your culture, what do people need to start economically transacting? What capital do they need? How mobile is that capital? In other words, how easily does the capital flow between people and between sectors of the economy? And is capital centralized in the hands of a few people, or is it widely distributed, or does the state control capital? Okay, so that's your core level, your foundational, your objective, your production. Next up is your exchange level. Okay, so your exchange layer is your trade, distribution, and monetary functions. Now, I have spoken multiple times about currencies, so there'll be links to those videos eventually in this link, but you can check those videos on my channel, where I've got links on how to do currency. But the important part here is actually about who controls the monetary supply. Is there a central bank or some kind of magical equivalent? Are inflation and currency stable? How is wealth distributed within your society? Does the government ensure equal access to resources, or is wealth concentrated in a few hands, or is there some kind of, is it distributed across the community? And then how do people trade? This is not external trade yet. This is within the community, right? So, do people trade with money inside the community, or do they trade in a gift giving manner, or do they trade in a manner that is like, a kind of a favor manner, or you just give to your community because the community as a whole always works together? Is it that kind of anarchistic principles? So what you want to think about here is, how independent are people? How dependent are they on each other? Like, if they're fully independent, they don't trade at all, how does that work? If they're specialized and they have kind of that, there's a shoemaker and a hat maker and so on, how do they enact trade between them, and what regulates that trade? Then your next layer up is your societal layer, which is basically your institutions and your laws and your culture. Because again, economy does not exist in a vacuum. Okay. And this is where you need to ask questions like, is the state a regulator for market forces, or does the state actively participate in the economy, or does the state just laissez-faire, let it all go, and like people can just do whatever they like? And bear in mind here that you can have, everything from a centrally planned economy all the way to like the kind of medieval traditional economies of like, no, the merchants can do whatever. Um, and then your last layer in this model is your global trade and adaptability. Okay. And this is basically, how does your economy interact outside of itself, right? How does your economy trade with other cultures? Do they have merchants that come out? Are they open and welcoming? And how adaptable are they to shocks? Like, what happens if there's a environmental disaster, like a volcano erupts? What happens if there's an economic disaster, the harvest fails? What happens if they're attacked? How adaptable is your economy to these shocks? And how much are they driven to trade externally, and how much are they driven to trade internally? And yeah, Tabby Wolf says laws and culture don't exist in a void. Absolutely not. Like, laws, culture, economy, it's all a glorious mess. When you build it together. Like, I can talk about it as separate things, and I do, because you can't talk about everything all at once. But when you build it, you're going to be building a piece of culture, then building a piece of economy, then building a piece of culture, then building a law, then building a piece of culture. It's crazy town. Crazy town. So yeah. So this is the basic model, right? So this is my idea of the basic economic model that a world builder should build in their world. But there's two more aspects that I just want to talk about, and that is, so these two red lines are obviously obviously they're very clumsy right now. That's because I slapped them in PowerPoint. But basically the idea is that this is your fantasy magical elements and your technological elements, right? Because the thing is, if your technology changes, or if your fantasy changes, like your base magic changes, you get a new spell, or your technology changes, you get something like the printing press, or some kind of automated process, becomes technologically available. Your whole economy is affected from the global layer all the way through. And you need to have those kinds of lightning rod uh, drawings in mind to understand what can rock your economy to the core, what can really shatter your economy's take on it. Okay, so that is the model overall. I don't know if there are any comments at this point. I have some examples that I will quite happily go through, if no one has questions. That is basically like taking economies in our world and talking through how I see them in this model, so that you've got like some kind of example to work with. Um, okay, so I will go on to those examples, and we'll see how this goes. Alrighty. So the examples that I picked to go with is feudal, mercantile America's Gilded Age and the Soviet Union. I figured they were pretty much the extremists in terms of like economic systems. So in the feudal system, our core would be wealth is concentrated in land ownership, and rights to everything is pretty much held by the nobility, with peasants bound to the land. In mercantile economies, wealth is held by merchant and state chartered companies, and the state actively supports trade. In America, during the mercantile economies, by the way, are the economies that Europe had in place during the height of colonialism, and when they did the big sea voyages and so on. They were basically going out on state-sponsored voyages to find trading partners, or make trading partners in some cases. Anyway, America's Gilded Age is when wealth is concentrated in the ownership of industrialists and capitalists, and you have absolutely minimal regulation over corporate wealth. And then the Soviet Union economy is state ownership of wealth and control over resources with centralized planning dictating disposal rights. Okay, so that's our core of those economies. Then, in terms of the foundational production and exchange layers, our feudal economy has got agricultural resources and they aim for self sufficiency of local estates. They're primarily agrarian, and they have very limited trade, to be honest with you. Exchange is often local and non-monetary, such as barter. Obviously, they did have coins. I mean, we have some of their coins, but a lot of the low-level exchanges were just barter exchanges. Sometimes people even paid their taxes in barter to the local lord. Your mercantile economy has got access to overseas resources and colonies. They focus on accumulating wealth. And the production centers on goods for trades, especially manufactured goods, and the development of global trade. And their whole exchange thing is development of global trade networks, and they have heavy regulation by state monopolies. And then America during the Gilded Age, you have the industrial resources. This is where your big industrial pushes start coming in, right? Where you have resources like coal, steel, infrastructure, and you have a focus on wealth accumulation of individuals. You have rapid industrialization with a focus on manufacturing and infrastructure. There's a boom in domestic and international trade, rising of stock exchange and banking. Soviet Union, a very command-driven example, state-driven goals with a focus on industrial and military resources and a strong focus on political goals, right? The Soviet Union was extremely ideologically driven. Then the production layer is centralized production focusing on industrial and military outputs, and the exchange is minimal use of money, state controlled distribution, limited international trade, because it is a very, very different kind of approach to the economy, right? I will say though, for all that, like I say all of that about the Soviet Union, they were actually Finland's biggest trading partner, and the eastern border of Finland was very, 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 very sad when the Soviet Union fell apart, because the Soviets used to come across the border to shop in in Finland, because everybody needs goods from somewhere. Um, anyway, little anecdote there. Then our next one is the societal and the interaction layer. So, on a societal layer, you have our feudal economy has got that monarchies, lords, and vassal relationships basically dominate the whole society and also the economy. Um, and you have limited trade with neighboring regions, very limited, because you also have little adaptability, and you have very little adaptability due to the very rigid social hierarchy. When you're very rigid in your hierarchy and you receive a shock, an external shock, like some of the fantasy elements change or the environment changes or the economy changes, it is very hard for an economic system and a cultural system for that matter to adapt. Um, Then the mercantile economy, you have strong state involvement with support of guilds and trade companies, and they are expanding trade routes. They're expanding overseas, especially with with the colonies. They're very adaptable to increase wealth and expand markets. Then America during the Gilded Age has got weak labor rights, limited social welfare, and you have the rise of monopolies and trusts during this period. And then they have expansive global trade, high adaptability with technology and infrastructure growth. And then the Soviet Union has got the centralized government institutions, focus on state welfare and control, limited trade outside of the Eastern Bloc. The adaptability is kind of shaky, as we saw in the 80s. Okay, and that's yeah, that's my examples. That's my thought on building an economy. You guys have been very, very quiet in the comments. I'm uh, very interested in opinions at this point. I really do hope I didn't make this hyper freaking jargon filled and economic orientated. um, because yeah, it wasn't my intent to make it jargon filled, but um, I did study economics at university, so sometimes I use terms without realizing that they're not terms outside of the economic models. Um, um, thanks, Lupix. I'm really glad because you are one of the big one of the people I've bounced this off has been Lupix. But like me, he's also in knows the jargon. Um, so my idea was to layer this with the culture, right? Because we have the whole culture building model with the norms and so on. And then the economic model, you know, slots together with that. And then in the book that I'm working on, the world building book that I'm working on, that I'm doing the podcasts and so on for, both of these models will then be part of your whole building process in the book, and you'll have like a worksheet to work with that, to work with both those models and kind of fill them in, and there'll be questions for each layer, and then at the cultural layer as well. And those worksheets are available to my members right now. Not the economics one yet because I'm still working on it, but my members get early access to those worksheets. Um, yeah, so let's talk a little bit about scarcity. Okay, so scarcity basically determines the value of something. Yeah, so Tabby Wolf says making important materials in the setting rare can help making it valuable. Absolutely, right. Scarcity does drive value. That 100%, is a valid perspective. But you can also have something that isn't necessarily um, scarce, but it is still of enormous value depending on its production cost or its cost to other people. Like, I'll give you an example. Let's say that you have a magic system that runs on memories, on people's memories. So every time you cast a spell, you have to give up something that you remember. And the bigger magical effect you want, the more of your memory you have to sacrifice. At this point, memory becomes a resource in your world, right? Your actual memories that you make become a resource. And so, I mean, people have bazillions of memories. They're very common, they're everywhere. But it is expensive to use that resource nonetheless because of its personal cost to the person giving up the memory. If you see what I mean, Tabby Wolf. So absolutely, scarcity is a big driver of value, but it's not the only driver. Um, Smoky Dimension says aluminium used to be very pricey. Absolutely. Aluminium was at one point more expensive than gold because the process to extract it without the Industrial Revolution is incredibly difficult. You can do it. Like, you don't need the Industrial Revolution to have aluminium, but it is incredibly expensive to extract. I actually, in my world, I had aluminium for like 5 minutes. And then on the beta read, everybody objected to aluminium. Literally everybody was like, you can't have aluminium without the electric process to extract it. And I was like, you can. It's just very expensive. But nobody wanted to hear that. So I cut it out and replaced it with platinum or something stupid, like whatever. Like, I thought my aluminium was way cool, but apparently, like, people's expectations on aluminium is just way too set. They're like, no, you can't have aluminium unless you've had an industrial revolution. So There we go. Um, but yeah, that's my economic blah blah blah, my yapping on the economy. Um, would you guys like this slide deck? Would you like to be able to download the slide deck from somewhere? Should I put it up in like Kofi or somewhere? I can just print it to PDF and you can download it from there. Um, so let me know in comments or chat or whatnot. There will not be a live stream in November. I have bought a house, yay me. But that does mean I am moving in November, so I have been filming videos like a crazy woman. Um, so yeah. So that I can move during November. Octanon says makes me want to build a world that defies all forms of the Tiffany effect. Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Carrie. Yeah. So I'm very pleased that with the house and everything else, but because I am currently renting, I do have a little. I am a little bit stuck. I do need to have a month to clean up. Uh, S- Smoky Dimension asks, does the new house have a sauna? Yes, absolutely. I live in Finland. Every house has a sauna, or it's very disappointing if a house does not have a sauna. Alex B says, I think Mistborn uses aluminium, except it may be set in some sort of post-industrial apocalypse. I haven't finished it, so it may have those processes. So, Alex, I'm not going to spoil anything. Mistborn's relationship with minerals is complicated. It's great. And I actually I have a lot of appreciation for the Mistborn world building. But the thing is, my world was very much, well, my world is in the Lumiaron. It's very much set in like a feudal equivalent, not feudal, because I assumed that my Roman Empire never fell, so I never developed full feudalism. But in the world, but it's kind of medieval Europe, right? It's inspired by medieval Europe, and I think that is why I got so much pushback on aluminium, because it's one of those facts that people, it's like porcelain. People don't know how valuable porcelain was at one point. So yeah. Uh Lupik says, I have aluminium in my world. It's in the early stage of industrialization. So it's based on the context. Yep. um, Diane, you are very welcome to ask me some questions about your world. I will answer a few while I'm online. Yeah. I don't know how much help I'll be like immediately in the live stream, but you are welcome to ask a few questions. Smokey says magic can make electricity. Yep, it absolutely can. Magic can totally make electricity. So, there is. If you have that kind of magic system, I don't. Unfortunately, my magic doesn't make electricity, but it does other things. So, uh, one of those things. It always puzzles me a little bit about D&D worlds. Like, if you're in a D&D world and people can make electricity from a spell, how come they don't have like full-blown electricity, like Eberron style? Why is every world not steampunk Eberron? Anyway, side note. Tabby Wolf, the cryptocurrency can't be physical stuff. I mean, sure. Yeah, I'll send you a link, Smoke Dementia, about how aluminium without electricity can be done and why it was so expensive at that point. Yeah, Mage Punk is way underrated, and it makes it works so well with D&D. Like, with a D&D setup, having like a mage punk world with that kind of magic system works so well. Matthew says he's doing that with his Atlantis stories with technomancy. Fantastic. I love me some technomancy. I think technomancy is amazing. I didn't do it in my world because, of course, I didn't, because I created a different magic system. But I wanted a very specific kind of feel and flavor for my world. So here we are. You are a little bit late. We are in the questions section of the stream. We have been going for 40 minutes. So our current stream time is 40 minutes, and you are welcome to ask about elemental magic. So how would elemental magic affect the economy? So I think like Legend of Korra is probably, well, Avatar: The Last Airbender is probably your kind of gold standard here. In Legend of Korra, you have lightning bending, but even before that, in Avatar: The Last Airbender, you have like fire elementals driving the industrial processes and the steam engines of the Fire Nation. And you also you have earth people capable of, like, raising things up and building on the fly. And you have, air people could create lightning out of air as well, and so on. So elemental magic can quite fundamentally affect your um your economic system in terms of driving industry, right? So in that economic model that I showed, that would be at your production layer, where your magic would then become a production input into your economic creation process. And so it would affect your economy from top to bottom. I hope that answers your question, Kuno. Octane says he keeps his they keep their mage punk, their D&D setting low magic. Fair enough. Alex says everything depends on how easy it is to use elemental magic. Yeah, that too. Like with everything magic and economics related, how commonly available your magic is will have a massive impact on how much of an impact it has on the economy. So the bigger the more available magic is, the more impact it'll have on the economy, of course. Dion says my favorite people are the Dracuni. They're a lizard species. That sounds great. Carl P says Renaissance era floating city with magical soil grows food so easily it's abundant as water. The city trades with grounders. How could an economic system work, and what value does it add to my story? I mean, ask yourself first, what is the floating city? And what value is the floating city to your story? Why do you have a floating city? Is it rule of cool? Because if so, it's very cool. You don't need more than rule of cool, it's fine. But bear in mind that they are up in the sky. They do have certain limitations. So they're going to have to figure out some way to trade. And there could be a great deal of tension between them and the people who live on the ground in terms of trade. And what happens to the city if that ground level trade is cut off and they can't trade anymore? Maybe there's building materials that they get from the ground, or wood, or something. Like, I would put in some kind of limitation to work that in. Dion says, so their economy is basically conquer more land to feed hosts. Yeah, that sounds like a mercantile type economy, or a so on. Kuno says, also, I saw your last video on the economy and was curious if you could give some kind of fantasy magical example of community and market economy. So a community and market economy, to my mind, would be something like, let's say, think of it like there's a community that owns a farm, all right? So they own perhaps a farm of horses, all right? Then there's a community that owns a farm of I don't know, potatoes, and they trade with each other. So you effectively have communities that still produce goods for trade based on what the market needs, but it's the community that owns their production layer, they own their resources, and they have the right to distribute the profits that result from their labor, right? So they've now traded their horses, they've got a whole bunch of money coming in. That money doesn't go to an individual, it goes to the community that is invested in the horse farm. That's how it works. Matthew says, I'm trying to do something a little different with the 5 empires of the sea. Oof, you're gonna have to. So Matthew and everybody who's asking me detailed questions, like I'll answer as many as I can, but it is hard to answer these kinds of questions like immediately on the fly. You can buy an hour session with me on my Ko-fi page where I will go through your notes. You can send me your notes beforehand, and then I will actually like spend an hour going through your world, giving you my thoughts, giving you feedback, and answering any questions that you have. So what I would do with the sea is I would focus on things like currents, and the heat of those currents, like warm water versus cold water currents, and depth. I would very definitively focus on depth in terms of sea empires. Um, Dion, I absolutely can. I like the Yoruba and the Mali Empire as well. I based one of my empires off the Akhtun Empire from Ethiopia. So um, yeah, my cat's been crying. Alex says the limit for floating city might be space. Yeah. Um, Tabby says, I thought I should iterate on one of the currencies in science fiction setting I'm working on. It's an ongoing process. Yep. It's always worth iterating over them. It's always worth revisiting your old world building and seeing like how you feel about it now. You know, that's always my advice is to think about um to go back to your old world building and see how you feel about it now and where you want to be with it now. Yeah, I will put a link. There should be a link in the description of the live stream, but I will absolutely put a link in the description of the live stream. Um, Let me quickly pop a link in here. Ko-fi. So this is the direct link that you want. But the shop itself is quite easy to find. It's ko-fi.com just in time worlds. And you can there's a whole bunch of like worksheets. Some of them are free, some of them you have to pay for, that you can also download from there and so on. And then yeah, I do sell world building sessions on there that you can actually like, you know, engage with me and have an hour of my time. And I will read as as part of the preparation for that. I will read up to 15,000, 20,000 words worth of world building. So, because people have asked how much can they send me? That's kind of my limit. If I can't read it inside of 2 hours, then like I'm gonna draw a line. But as long as I can read it in 2 hours, kind of consume the world building in 2 hours, then I'm very happy to engage with your notes and give you feedback. Okay, guys. Yeah, it has been a great stream. It's been fun as always to spend time with you all. Remember, there's also a Discord server that you can go ahead and join. The Discord server's got like people in it that also engage in world building and chat about writing and all the rest of that. And I will see you again, not in November, but in December in my new studio, new house, all that kind of stuff. And there'll be a poll up for what you would like me to live stream on. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you as always, and I will see you soon. Thank you, Lupex. Great to see you on the stream. Bye, guys.